1, Chapter 4. What actions were done by Alexander Jannes, who reigned 27 years, and now the king's wife loosed the king's brethren, and made Alexander king, who appeared both elder in age, and more moderate in his temper than the rest, who, when he came to the government, slew one of his brethren, as affecting to govern himself, but had the other of them in great esteem, as loving a quiet life, without meddling with public affairs. Now it happened that there was a battle between him and Ptolemy, who was called Lathyrus, who had taken the city Asokis. He indeed slew a great many of his enemies, but the victory rather inclined to Ptolemy. But when this Ptolemy was pursued by his mother Cleopatra, and retired into Egypt, Alexander besieged Gadara, and took it, as also he did Amathus, which was the strongest of all the fortresses that were about Jordan, and therein were the most precious of all the possessions of Theodorus, the son of Zeno. Whereupon Theodorus marched against him, and took what belonged to himself, as well as the king's baggage, and slew 10,000 of the Jews. However, Alexander recovered this blow, and turned his force towards the maritime parts, and took Raphia and Gaza, with Anthedon also, which was afterwards called Agrippias by King Herod. But when he had made slaves of the citizens of all these cities, the nation of the Jews made an insurrection against him at a festival. For at those feasts seditions are generally begun, and it looked as if he should not be able to escape the plot they had laid for him, had not his foreign auxiliaries, the Pisidians and Cilicians, assisted him. For as to the Syrians, he never admitted them among his mercenary troops, on account of their innate enmity against the Jewish nation. And when he had slain more than 6,000 of the rebels, he made an incursion into Arabia. And when he had taken that country, together with the Gileadites and Moabites, he enjoined them to pay him tribute, and returned to Areathus. And as Theodorus was surprised at his great success, he took the fortress and demolished it. However, when he fought with Obodas, king of the Arabians, who had laid an ambush for him near Golan, and a plot against him, he lost his entire army, which was crowded together in a deep valley, and broken to pieces by the multitude of camels. And when he had made his escape to Jerusalem, he provoked the multitude, which hated him before, to make an insurrection against him, and this on account of the greatness of the calamity that he was under. However, he was then too hard for them, and in the several battles that were fought on both sides, he slew not fewer than 50,000 of the Jews in the interval of 6 years. Yet had he no reason to rejoice in these victories, since he did but consume his own kingdom, till at length he left off fighting, and endeavored to come to a composition with them, by talking with his subjects. But this mutability and irregularity of his conduct made them hate him still more. And when he asked them why they so hated him, and what he should do in order to appease them, they said, by killing himself, for that it would be then all they could do to be reconciled to him, who had done such tragical things to them, even when he was dead. At the same time, they invited Demetrius, who was called Eucerus, to assist them. And as he readily complied with their requests, in hopes of great advantages, and came with his army, the Jews joined with those their auxiliaries about Shechem. Yet did Alexander meet both these forces with 1,000 horsemen, and 8,000 mercenaries that were on foot. He had also with him that part of the Jews which favored him, to the number of 10,000, while the adverse party had 3,000 horsemen, and 14,000 footmen. Now, before they joined battle. The kings made proclamation and endeavored to draw off each other's soldiers and make them revolt, while Demetrius hoped to induce Alexander's mercenaries to leave him, and Alexander hoped to induce the Jews that were with Demetrius to leave him. But since neither the Jews would leave off their rage, nor the Greeks prove unfaithful, they came to an engagement, and to a close fight with their weapons, in which battle Demetrius was the conqueror, although Alexander's mercenaries showed the greatest exploits, both in soul and body. Yet did the upshot of this battle prove different from what was expected as to both of them, for neither did those that invited Demetrius to come to them continue firm to him, though he was conqueror, and 6,000 Jews, out of pity to the change of Alexander's condition, when he was fled to the mountains, came over to him. Yet could not Demetrius bear this turn of affairs, but supposing that Alexander was already become a match for him again, and that all the nation would at length run to him, he left the country, and went his way. However, the rest of the Jewish multitude did not lay aside their quarrels with him, when the foreign auxiliaries were gone, but they had a perpetual war with Alexander, until he had slain the greatest part of them, and driven the rest into the city Bernizelis. And when he had demolished that city, he carried the captives to Jerusalem. Nay, his rage was grown so extravagant that his barbarity proceeded to the degree of impiety. For when he had ordered 800 to be hung upon crosses in the midst of the city, he had the throats of their wives and children cut before their eyes, and these executions he saw as he was drinking and lying down with his concubines, upon which so deep a surprise seized on the people, that 8,000 of his opposers fled away the very next night, out of all Judea, whose flight was only terminated by Alexander's death. So at last, though not till late, and with great difficulty, he, by such actions, procured quiet to his kingdom, and left off fighting any more. Yet did that Antiochus, who was also called Dionysius, become an origin of troubles again. This man was the brother of Demetrius, and the last of the race of the Seleucidae. Alexander was afraid of him when he was marching against the Arabians. So he cut a deep trench between Antipatris, which was near the mountain, and the shores of Joppa. He also erected a high wall before the trench, and built wooden towers, in order to hinder any sudden approaches. But still he was not able to exclude Antiochus, for he burnt the towers, and filled up the trenches, and marched on with his army. And as he looked upon taking his revenge on Alexander for endeavoring to stop him, as a thing of less consequence, he marched directly against the Arabians, whose king retired into such parts of the country as were fittest for engaging the enemy, and then on the sudden made his horse turn back, which were in number 10,000, and fell upon Antiochus's army while they were in disorder, and a terrible battle ensued. Antiochus's troops, so long as he was alive, fought it out, although a mighty slaughter was made among them by the Arabians. But when he fell, for he was in the forefront, in the utmost danger, in rallying his troops, they all gave ground, and the greatest part of his army were destroyed, either in the action or the flight. And for the rest, who fled to the village of Cana, it happened that they were all consumed by want of necessaries, a few only excepted. About this time it was that the people of Damascus, out of their hatred to Ptolemy, the son of Menhens, invited Aretas to take the government, and made him king of Celesyria. This man also made an expedition against Judea, and beat Alexander in battle, but afterwards retired by mutual agreement. But Alexander, when he had taken Pella, marched to Gerasa again. Out of the covetous desire he had of Theodorus's possessions. And when he had built a triple wall about the garrison, he took the place by force. He also demolished Golan and Seleucia, and what was called the Valley of Antiochus. Besides which, he took the strong fortress of Gamala, and stripped Demetrius, who was governor therein, of what he had, on account of the many crimes laid to his charge, and then returned into Judea, after he had been 3 whole years in this expedition. And now he was kindly received of the nation, because of the good success he had. So when he was at rest from war, he fell into a distemper, for he was afflicted with a quartan ague, and supposed that, by exercising himself again in martial affairs, he should get rid of this distemper. But by making such expeditions at unseasonable times, and forcing his body to undergo greater hardships than it was able to bear, he brought himself to his end. He died, therefore, in the midst of his troubles, after he had reigned 27 years. Book 1, Chapter 5. Alexander reigns 9 years, during which time the Pharisees were the real rulers of the nation. Now Alexander left the kingdom to Alexandra his wife, and depended upon it that the Jews would now very readily submit to her, because she had been very averse to such cruelty as he had treated them with, and had opposed his violation of their laws, and had thereby got the goodwill of the people. Nor was he mistaken as to his expectations, for this woman kept the dominion by the opinion that the people had of her piety, for she chiefly studied the ancient customs of her country, and cast those men out of the government that offended against their holy laws. And as she had 2 sons by Alexander, she made Hyrcanus the elder high priest on account of his age, as also, besides that, on account of his inactive temper, no way disposing him to disturb the public. But she retained the younger, Aristobulus, with her as a private person, by reason of the warmth of his temper. And now the Pharisees joined themselves to her, to assist her in the government. These are a certain sect of the Jews that appear more religious than others, and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. Now Alexandra hearkened to them to an extraordinary degree, as being herself a woman of great piety towards God. But these Pharisees artfully insinuated themselves into her favor by little and little, and became themselves the real administrators of the public affairs. They banished and reduced whom they pleased. They bound and loosed men at their pleasure, for and, to say all at once, they had the enjoyment of the royal authority, whilst the expenses and the difficulties of it belonged to Alexandra. She was a sagacious woman in the management of great affairs, and intent always upon gathering soldiers together, so that she increased the army the 1/2, and procured a great body of foreign troops, till her own nation became not only very powerful at home, but terrible also to foreign potentates, while she governed other people. And the Pharisees governed her. Accordingly, they themselves slew Diogenes, a person of figure, and one that had been a friend to Alexander, and accused him as having assisted the king with his advice for crucifying the 800 men before mentioned. They also prevailed with Alexandra to put to death the rest of those who had irritated him against them. Now she was so superstitious as to comply with their desires, and accordingly they slew whom they pleased themselves. But the principal of those that were in danger fled to Aristobulus, who persuaded his mother to spare the men on account of their dignity, but to expel them out of the city, unless she took them to be innocent. So they were suffered to go unpunished, and were dispersed all over the country. But when Alexandra sent out her army to Damascus, under pretense that Ptolemy was always oppressing that city, she got possession of it, nor did it make any considerable resistance. She also prevailed with Tigranes, king of Armenia, who lay with his troops about Ptolemy, and besieged Cleopatra, 5 by agreements and presents to go away. Accordingly, Tigranes soon arose from the siege, by reason of those domestic tumults which happened upon Lucullus's expedition into Armenia. 4. In the meantime, Alexandra fell sick, and Aristobulus, her younger son, took hold of this opportunity with his domestics, of which he had a great many, who were all of them his friends, on account of the warmth of their youth, and got possession of all the fortresses. He also used the sums of money he found in them to get together a number of mercenary soldiers, and made himself king. And besides this, upon Hyrcanus's complaint to his mother, she compassionated his case, and put Aristobulus's wife and sons under restraint in Antonia, which was a fortress that joined to the north part of the temple. It was, as I have already said, of old called the citadel, but afterwards got the name of Antonia, when Antony was lord of the east, just as the other cities, Sebastia and Agrippias, had their names changed, and these given them from Sebastus and Agrippa. But Alexandra died before she could punish Aristobulus for his disinheriting his brother, after she had reigned 9 years. Book 1, Chapter 6. When Hyrcanus, who was Alexander's heir, receded from his claim to the crown, Aristobulus is made king, and afterward the same Hyrcanus, by the means of Antipater, is brought back by Abetus. At last Pompey is made the arbitrator of the dispute between the brothers. 1. Now Hyrcanus was heir to the kingdom, and to him did his mother commit it before she died. But Aristobulus was superior to him in power and magnanimity. And when there was a battle between them to decide the dispute about the kingdom near Jericho, the greatest part deserted Hyrcanus and went over to Aristobulus. But Hyrcanus, with those of his party who stayed with him, fled to Antonia, and got into his power the hostages that might be for his preservation, which were Aristobulus's wife with her children. But they came to an agreement before things should come to extremities, that Aristobulus should be king, and Hyrcanus should resign that up, but retain all the rest of his dignities, as being the king's brother. Hereupon they were reconciled to each other in the temple, and embraced one another in a very kind manner. While the people stood round about them, they also changed their houses, while Aristobulus went to the royal palace, and Hyrcanus retired to the house of Aristobulus. Now those other people which were at variance with Aristobulus were afraid upon his unexpected obtaining the government, and especially this concerned Antipater, 6 whom Aristobulus hated of old. He was by birth an Idumean, and one of the principal of that nation, on account of his ancestors and riches, and other authority to him belonging. He also persuaded Hyrcanus to fly to Aretas, the king of Arabia, and to lay claim to the kingdom, as also he persuaded Aretas to receive Hyrcanus, and to bring him back to his kingdom. He also cast great reproaches upon Aristobulus as to his morals, and gave great commendations to Hyrcanus, and exhorted Aretas to receive him, and told him how becoming a filing it would be for him, who ruled so great a kingdom, to afford his assistance to such as are injured, alleging that Hyrcanus was treated unjustly by being deprived of that dominion which belonged to him by the prerogative of his birth. And when he had predisposed them both to do what he would have them, he took Hyrcanus by night and ran away from the city. And, continuing his flight with great swiftness, he escaped to the place called Petra, which is the royal seat of the king of Arabia, where he put Hyrcanus into Aretas's hand, and by discoursing much with him, and gaining upon him with many presents, he prevailed with him to give him an army that might restore him to his kingdom. This army consisted of 50,000 footmen and horsemen, against which Aristobulus was not able to make resistance, but was deserted in his first onset, and was driven to Jerusalem. He also had been taken at first by force, if Scaurus, the Roman general, had not come and seasonably interposed himself and raised the siege. This Scaurus was sent into Syria from Armenia by Pompey the Great, when he fought against Tigranes. So Scaurus came to Damascus, which had been lately taken by Metellus and Lollius, and caused them to leave the place. And, upon his hearing how the affairs of Judea stood, he made haste thither as to a certain booty. As soon, therefore, as he was come into the country, there came ambassadors from both the brothers, each of them desiring his assistance. But Aristobulus's 300 talents had more weight with him than the justice of the cause, which sum, when Scaurus had received, he sent a herald to Hyrcanus and the Arabians, and threatened them with the resentment of the Romans and of Pompey, unless they would raise the siege. So Aretas was terrified, and retired out of Judea to Philadelphia, as did Scaurus return to Damascus again. Nor was Aristobulus satisfied with escaping out of his brother's hands, but gathered all his forces together, and pursued his enemies, and fought them at a place called Papyron, and slew about 6,000 of them, and, together with them, Antipater's brother Phalion. When Hyrcanus and Antipater were thus deprived of their hopes from the Arabians, they transferred the same to their adversaries, and because Pompey had passed through Syria and was come to Damascus, they fled to him for assistance, and, without any bribes, they made the same equitable pleas that they had used to Aretas, and besought him to hate the violent behavior of Aristobulus, and to bestow the kingdom on him, to whom it justly belonged, both on account of his good character and on account of his superiority in age. However, neither was Aristobulus wanting to himself in this case, as relying on the bribes that Scaurus had received. He was also there himself, and adorned himself after a manner the most agreeable to royalty that he was able. But he soon thought it beneath him to come in such a servile manner, and could not endure to serve his own ends in a way so much more abject than he was used to. So he departed from Diospolis. At this his behavior Pompey had great indignation. Hyrcanus also and his friends made great intercessions to Pompey. So he took not only his Roman forces, but many of his Syrian auxiliaries, and marched against Aristobulus. But when he had passed by Pella and Scythopolis, and was come to Corea, where you enter into the country of Judea, when you go up to it through the Mediterranean parts, he heard that Aristobulus was fled to Alexandrium, which is a stronghold, fortified with the utmost magnificence, and situated upon a high mountain. And he sent to him, and commanded him to come down. Now his inclination was to try his fortune in a battle, since he was called in such an imperious manner, rather than to comply with that call. However, he saw the multitude were in great fear, and his friends exhorted him to consider what the power of the Romans was, and how it was irresistible. So he complied with their advice, and came down to Pompey. And when he had made a long apology for himself, and for the justness of his cause in taking the government, he returned to the fortress. And when his brother invited him again to plead his cause, he came down and spake about the justice of it, and then went away without any hindrance from Pompey. So he was between hope and fear. And when he came down, it was to prevail with Pompey to allow him the government entirely. And when he went up to the citadel, it was that he might not appear to debase himself too low. However, Pompey commanded him to give up his fortified places, and forced him to write to every one of their governors to yield them up, they having had this charge given them, to obey no letters, but what were of his own handwriting. Accordingly, he did what he was ordered to do, but had still an indignation at what was done, and retired to Jerusalem, and prepared to fight with Pompey. But Pompey did not give him time to make any preparations for a siege, but followed him at his heels. He was also obliged to make haste in his attempt by the death of Mithridates, of which he was informed about Jericho. Now here is the most fruitful country of Judea, which bears a vast number of palm trees, 7, besides the balsam tree, whose sprouts they cut with sharp stones, and at the incisions they gather the juice, which drops down like tears. So Pompey pitched his camp in that place one night, and then hasted away the next morning to Jerusalem. But Aristobulus was so affrighted at his approach that he came and met him by way of supplication. He also promised him money, and that he would deliver up both himself and the city into his disposal, and thereby mitigated the anger of Pompey. Yet did not he perform any of the conditions he had agreed to, for Aristobulus's party would not so much as admit Gabinius into the city, who was sent to receive the money that he had promised.